story about his headstone here.
I'm Honey Glover. I'm the daughter of Mary and Howe Glover. And her father's name is on the bottom, Norman E. Howe. And I always understood that William Howe, when he went down the road in the buggy, saw this rock, and he always hit it with the whip, the horse whip, and said, "I'm going to have that on my hip for my headstone when I die." And so this is the stone that he whipped with it. I don't see any marks from the whip, but that's okay.
So this stone is William Edward Fetty Place Howe's stone. Also buried here is his wife, Harriet Gizzy or Grizzy, depending on which source you refer to, Lund. And they had two sons, John Wadsworth Howe and Norman Edward Howe. Their son, Norman Edward, is also buried here. And we go back to William's sister, Lucy Ann, who's also buried here. So this is a combination of generations and people at this site. Norman Edward Howe was the older son of William and Harriet, and he was the police chief in Hollis, New Hampshire, and he was also the sheriff of Hillsborough County. And he lived to be 92 years old, died in 1962. So here we are at the site of the John Prentice Howe the first burial location. He was one of the 6 children of young Nathaniel and Elmira. He's buried here with his wife, Olive Wilson Farwell. So it's John Prentice Howe, Olive Wilson Farwell. They had one son, William Farwell Howe, who is here, and he was married to Jenabel Dennett Howe, and she's buried here. So we're on the reverse side of the stone here with the dates for the people who are buried in this location. John Prentice Howe, 1837 to 1915. His wife, Olive Wilson Howe, 1842 to 1947. She was 105 years, just shy of 105 years old when she passed away. And there's a story about Olive. She grew up in Nashua, near Hollis, and she taught at a one-room schoolhouse in Hollis, or actually, it may well have been Nashua on Coburn Avenue. But the story goes that when she was a young girl, President Abraham Lincoln came on the train to Library Hill in Nashua, New Hampshire, and she shook President Lincoln's hand. And it was a memory that she never forgot. And when you think about it, she died on January 30th, 1947, and I was born on January 30th, 1945, so our lives overlapped by 2 years exactly. And so if you look at degrees of separation, or how many degrees of separation between me and President Lincoln, there's just great Aunt Olive. So it's something to think about that we're that close to the history of our country, standing here today in 2018. So now we're back to the William Edward Fetty Place Howe branch of the family, as opposed to his brother John Prentice Howe that we just spoke about. William Edward and Harriet Gizzy had 2 sons. We just mentioned Norman Edward, who was the sheriff of Hillsborough County. And here is his brother, his younger brother, John Wadsworth Howe, born in 1872, and he died in 1945. And he married Lottie Emmer Calderwood from Vermont. She grew up near Craftsbury, Vermont, and came to Hollis to teach school in the Pine Hill Schoolhouse, the building that I spoke of earlier that my husband and I restored. She came down and she boarded at the Howe farm on Howe Lane and fell in love with the son of the owner, John, and they got married and had 7 children. So John and Lottie had, their 2 oldest sons were William Robert Howe, who's buried here, born in 1904, died in 1990. And the next in line was Norman Alexander Howe, born in 1907, and he died in 1986, and they are buried here. Next, we have the fourth child of John and Lottie, my father, Clarence Howe. He's buried here, Clarence Lund Howe, named after his middle name after his grandmother, Harriet Gizzy Lund, who we just spoke of earlier. My dad was married to my mom. Her name was Ethel Marion Lull, and she married a Howe. So that's why we have two Marion Howes in the family. We have my mother, who was Marion Lull, married a Howe, and we have Honey's mother, who was Marion Howe, who married a Glover. So it was, and they both lived in Hollis. It was a bit confusing at times. And then my brother is buried here also, Stephen Lull Howe. Now we're back to the John Prentice Howe line of the 6 children of Nathaniel and Elmira. John Prentice had a son, William. He was married to Jenny Bell. They had 3 children. The oldest was Dennett, and he's buried here, and his first wife, Esther, is buried next to him. She was born in 1909, died in 1947, and Dennett was born in 1909 and was buried in 2004. Then we come to Dennett's younger brother, John Prentice Howe II, the Reverend Dr. John Prentice Howe II. He is buried here along with a stone marking his wife, Phyllis. She is not buried here. She's buried out west. I think her ashes were scattered out west. But she does have her name on this stone, and her husband is here.
My name is Laurel Howe. I'm here at my grandparents' grave, John Howe and Phyllis Howe, and my dad was their child, Jeff Howe, and I never had the opportunity to meet them, but I've heard great things about them, and I really wish I could have, but I'm happy to be here now.
And finally, we're here at the Gordon Stone. This is Sally Gordon Howe Gordon Bixby Stone, and she was a sister to John and Dennett. Her husband is buried here, Robert Gordon, her first husband. We think he's actually buried down with the John P., the first stone, but his name is on this stone. And then he was buried here in 1976, and his wife Sally and her second husband, Arthur Bixby, were buried here in 2009. So now we're at the East Cemetery in Hollis on Wheeler Road, and we're here to see the gravesite of Elizabeth Rhodes Howe. She was the 6th child of Nathaniel and Elmira, who are buried at the Pine Hill Cemetery. We saw her brothers over there, Norman, William, and John, and her 2 sisters, Lucy Ann and Ellen. So this is Elizabeth. She was the oldest child of Nathaniel and Elmira, and she was married to Benjamin Luke Farley. He went and fought in the Civil War too, so he was the brother-in-law of Norman Rideout Howe, who lost his life in the Civil War, and he was also by marriage related to Pearlie Jewett, whose monument we saw at the Pine Hill Cemetery. And Lizzie was one of the 4 in that family who passed away during the Civil War. Her brother Norman, she died in 1863, or is it 4? 1863, and her little sister Ellen passed away, and their mother Elmira passed away, all at the same time. So anyway, Benjamin Luke Farley and Lizzie Rhodes had 4 children. They were William, born 1851, John Q., born 1852, Henry Boynton, born 1858, and Lizzie Ellen, born 1862. The large stone next to Lizzie Rhodes here is her daughter Elizabeth, and she married George Hayden. Elizabeth died in 1909, and George Hayden was born in 1858 and died in 1930. And to go back to Benjamin Luke Farley, after his wife Elizabeth passed away, he married again. He married a woman named Persis Plummer from Goffstown, New Hampshire, and they had 2 more daughters. Nettie and Benita, I believe, are their names. They are if you look up on Find a Grave, you can find some information on them. And also George Hayden and Elizabeth Hayden. I believe they ended up in Nashua, their children, rather. We are here on the east side of the East Cemetery on Wheeler Road now, and we're at the gravesite of Kenneth Calderwood Howe. He was one of the 7 children of John Wadsworth Howe and Lottie Emma Calderwood Howe. Kenneth was born June 23rd, 1914, and he passed away on May 7th, 1995. His wife, Ruth Seavey Howe, was born on August 15th, 1922, and as of this date, she is the last of my aunts and uncles who is still among the living. She's 96 years old. Across the way from Kenneth Howe is the gravesite of his older brother, John Wadsworth Howe, Jr. John was born March 8th, 1912, and he passed away on July 24th, 2005. His wife, Lucilla Hayes, was born May 6, 1916, and she passed away January 1st, 2013. And finally, we're over here at the Seeger Monument. This is the final resting place of Ruth Agnes Howe Seeger. She was born in 1916 and passed away in 2004. Her husband beside her, Alton B. Seeger, born 1913. He passed away in 1984. And their daughter, Roberta Ruth Seeger, born in 1944, and she passed away in 1978. Still here at the East Cemetery, we're at the gravesite of John Howe and Lottie Calderwood Howe's older daughter, Florence Brown. She was born in 1905 and passed away in 1987. Her husband, Roscoe Brown, born 1905, passed away in 1966. And their infant daughter, Lois, she was born in 1931 and passed away shortly after that.
Hi, my name's Carol Tabacaru. I'm a direct descendant of Norman E. Howe. I'm standing in front of the stone of Marion Eleanor Howe, who was married to Milton Glover. He passed away in 1988, she in 1992. The story goes that as a young child, as a young man, Milton worked for Grandpa Howe, Norman Howe, and he said to his sister who had brought him lunch, "If you wait a minute, the door will open and a lovely red-haired young girl will come out and she's going to be my wife." And that's how he fell in love with Marion. Their infant twin boys were born in 1929 and they passed away at birth. Their son Morris G. Glover, he passed away in 1960 in a car accident. My mother, Mabel G. Geddes, is here. She passed away in 2015. And my aunts also will reside here. My aunt Marjorie is here as well. She passed away in 2012.